We are now near the very end of the Thermocene epoch. The long period of relative warmth and stability Serina has so far experienced since the Cryocene is now beginning to change again as tectonic movements bring the most dramatic changes the Moon's environment have seen in over 100 million years. The map of Serina 175 million years post-establishment, at the very end of the Thermocene. The land. The continents of the East and West, separate for so long and evolving in splendid isolation, are now converging back together into a single landmass, with the long isolated Kyran Islands having recently connected via land bridges to both Anciska and Walteria. As so many continental plates begin to collide, plates slide under one another and volcanic ranges begin to rise. Rifts form, through which magma reaches the surface. Volcanism begins to increase once again toward the end of the Thermocene, flooding the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. The sudden buildup of uncontrolled greenhouse gas causes global temperatures to spike, even more than through the rest of the epoch. Equatorial regions become hotter, to the point that most water evaporates back into the atmosphere before ever falling as precipitation. Reduced rainfall causes vast stretches formerly supporting tropical forest to dry out. Assassin grass savannas come briefly to dominate again, pushing sunflower woodlands and remnant bamboo forest towards the South Pole and the northernmost edge of what remains of Striata. For now, temperate and tropical forests persist in cooler polar regions and along the shores of the diminishing inland areas and wide rivers. But these inland bodies of water, too, will now begin to drain away across most of the continents as temperatures rise. As the continents continue to converge and crash together, as volcanism continues to pump the atmosphere with carbon dioxide gas and temperatures rise, a new trend of widespread desertification, on a scale Serina has never before seen, will become the norm over much of the world. The sea. Acid rain and rising global temperatures begin to destabilize Serina's oceanic ecosystems at the end of the Thermocene, simultaneously lowering the pH and availability of dissolved oxygen of seas worldwide, with drastic consequences to life. A mass die-off of hard-shelled organisms begins first, with clams, coral hydra, and other reef builders in particular being unable to produce the shells they need to survive. Reefs are the first ecosystem to die out, the living builders bleached by warming seas, and the non-living limestone foundations breaking down as a result of an influx of carbonic acid into the oceans from a carbon-saturated greenhouse atmosphere. Toxic algal blooms, red tides, will continue to become more numerous and longer-lasting as a result of the high levels of carbon dioxide present in the water, providing favorable conditions for their development, and now sometimes cover massive portions of coastal seas, causing mass die-offs of marine life through the toxins produced when each individual algae cell in the bloom die off. As red tides become more abundant in shallow surface waters, they simultaneously block sunlight from reaching other plants and algae in the water and greatly deplete the oxygen in the water around where they bloom, further causing harm to fish and other aquatic life. In the wake of severe algal blooms, a positive feedback loop can result in the complete breakdown of the marine ecosystem, as reduced oxygen results in die-offs of plant and animal life, and subsequently lower the oxygen content of the water even more as these life forms then begin to decay. Worsening matters still, a sudden global die-off of marine life results in a huge surge of nitrogen into the global oceans, fertilizing still more and worse red tides. Seas across Serina become increasingly unstable at the end of the Thermocene, prone to large deoxygenated patches where few, if any, higher animals can survive. The life. The end of the Thermocene epoch will also be the end of many animal groups, particularly in the sea. Not only the shellfish will be negatively affected, but rather entire food chains. By 175 million years post-establishment, plankton numbers and the ocean fish stocks which depend on them have already begun to plummet in the wake of widespread anoxia events. The large marine birds and predator fishes follow suit, barreling towards extinction, as the end of the Thermocene mirrors its beginning, only at an even more severe scale of ecological collapse. On land, the decline of forests in place of grassland and desert is bad news for large browsers. Cerastriders and the large avitheres begin a rapid decline as the trees they feed on are pushed north and south by desertification. Though they will hold on for a while yet, as it will be a million years more before the continents fully collide, the inland seas drain completely away, and the forests they depend on are completely displaced. For most large browsers, their days are numbered in coming millennia. As for the trees themselves, temperate and taiga forests are pushed away even from the extreme poles by spreading tropical flora. From here on out, their holdouts will be the peaks of polar mountain ranges. But as the climate becomes hotter, even these refuges may prove unsuitable for their survival in the long run. The collision of the eastern and western hemispheres with both one another and the Kyrans Islands results in a significant faunal interchange. Vivas move westward and Cerastriders into the east, the first time their groups will have ever met since diverging over 160 million years ago. The Kyrans' aberrant island endemics, elephantches and their more primitive kin, face influxes of aggressive competitors, and by the end of the Thermocene, the majority of their native wildlife will have died out through a harsh combination of drying conditions, as the equatorial island's lush forests are displaced by dry grasslands, particularly the aggressive and poisonous assassin grasses, to which none of their native flora or fauna had evolved any resistance to, and competition from animal invaders from the east and west. The next few million years will bring the most extreme changes to the world of Serina its biosphere has yet experienced in its history. In the game of life, there will be many losers when this epoch concludes, but there will also be winners, as groups formerly kept to specialist niches find a place in the sun, as for many of their competitors, the world they've known comes to an untimely end. The world of Serina will soon be a very different place, though for now, familiar life clings to their old ways in the increasingly small patches where the forests that formerly dominated the moon still thrive. A scene of life upon the savannas of South Anciska in the late Thermocene. Two tyrant Serins, at rest, quietly observe as two male crackbacks fight for mating rights. Though these large predators are not likely to target a healthy adult, sometimes these battles are so prolonged and violent that the losing male is left so brutalized and weakened that it makes easy prey. Further behind, three more primitive, browsing serostriders, little changed over tens of millions of years, emerge from the morning fog and cross the open plains. To the left, a large flightless bubberb have startled a hopper from its nest in a thicket of grass and gives chase. If it catches the trivet, it will swallow it whole. But hoppers have been forged from a world where just about everything wants to kill them, and they are quick. There is no way to predict which will prevail in this sudden battle of survival. Soon, though, the day-to-day battles will be subsumed by an even more dramatic challenge. In the distance, a volcano pushed up along recently colliding continental boundaries sends out a plume of smoke into the morning air, an early sign of things to come. Things that none of these animals going about their day-to-day lives can comprehend. For very soon, the world as they know it will end. The Thermocene is now almost over. It will be remembered as one of the world's most prosperous and biodiverse eras, a rich tapestry of strange and beautiful organisms entwined together in rich and varied webs of life. But as time marches on, all of that is soon to change. Soon, chaos will shock long stable ecosystems. Life will either adapt to the harshest environmental changes to fall upon Serina yet, or will die trying. The last woodland. In one of the few relatively isolated continents still left on Serina at the end of the Thermocene, Polar Anciska, survives one of the last temperate sunflower and bamboo mixed forests on Serina, and certainly the largest. The climate here is not cold enough to snow with regularity, but frost occurs for several months in the fall along the island's northern coast, and plant growth halts during the winter season, even if not all plants lose their leaves. Due to the island's isolation and polar location, it has so far been less affected by the recent climate change of the end Thermocene boundary in comparison to large continents to the south. Indeed, becoming milder in climate has only increased its productivity. The dominant herbivores here are aardgeese and similar primitive flightless canaries, including some tall browsers, but none as large as the serostriders of bygone days, which survived in the larger mainland forests. There are relatively few terrestrial predators here, and most carnivores are in form of large airborne birds of prey. Small songbirds are abundant here, of course, feeding on rich pickings of seeds, fruit, buds, and insects. There are no trivets and no true mudwickets, though terrestrial eels hunt worms underground and in the leaf litter, and amphibious sorts ambush prey along the shores of rivers and pools. Insects are diverse in the form of crickets and beetles. Assassin grasses are absent, and ant-symbiotic bamboo trees still persist here, though nowhere near to the extremes of specialization seen in tropical locales of the past. Overall, even at the end of the Thermocene, Polar Anciska remains a vibrant island of life and a trove of living fossils and early divergent organisms, an arc of early diversity in a changing world. The fleeting relic. The island also happens to be the sole home, however, of at least one very derived bird, a group which colonized fairly recently from the south within the last few million years. It also happens to be one of the most beautiful and melodious, yet elusive, of all birds on Serina. It is a fluttering, fairy-like creature, shaped and sized like a common sparrow, but of incredible color to which few other birds can compare. Its tiny body shimmers brightly in the dappled forest sunlight with countless shades: violet, scarlet, green, blue, and gold, among others. Indeed, there is scarcely a color in the rainbow not present somewhere upon its feathered tapestry. In addition, it sports a melodious, bubbling song, seemingly far too loud to have ever come from such a tiny body, that fills the last temperate wood with life, sung by both sexes with equal vigor and beauty. Flitting through patches of sun and of shade, males and females alike warble and whistle with abandon, sometimes for several days before coming in contact with another of their kind, so rare is their species. Their songs become faster and more excited upon hearing another of their kind in the distance, and as soon as contact is heard, both parties make a beeline toward the source of the other song. The closer the pair come to one another until they join in a lengthy paired duet, a varied song of unrivaled melody that could hold its own among all songbirds, which becomes faster and faster until the birds meet and copulate. Once partnered, male and female will mate for life, fluttering from that point on in tandem and calling in duet, never apart for long, as if the partners simply cannot afford to spend a moment without their beloved. In truth, they cannot, for the birds' first time together is remarkably fleeting. It can only be found in the forest, only for about a month, and then it vanishes completely and suddenly within a matter of days. The forest falls eerily silent, and it will be nearly a decade before the woodland is serenaded again by the sweetly fleeting melody of the ninth-year canary. The ninth-year canary, as its name suggests, is a changeling bird with an even more specialized lifestyle than most. It matures into an adult only in the summer of its ninth year. For the vast majority of its life, it exists as a blind, embryo-like larvae feeding deep underground on the roots of forest trees and plants, gnawing at the tough tissues with its sharp mandibles and digging through the dirt with its claws. This diet is incredibly meager compared to its ancestral one of meat and protein, providing so little in the way of nutrition that it takes 8 full growing seasons to attain sufficient mass to transform into an adult bird. Indeed, without symbiotic stomach bacteria, the larvae would not be able to digest the cellulose of the tree's woody tissues at all. But little by little, the larvae of the canary does manage to gather everything it needs to become a bird. At that time, that brief period of maturity, in which all ninth-year canaries in a given population miraculously time their emergence from the ground together. Pairs do little more than court and mate. Unlike most changelings, male and female are identical, likely because their lifestyle doesn't require they utilize different food resources. Both sexes sing, unusually for their family, likely due to the need to find others of their kind after emerging, being a species with a very low population density. Indeed, the ninth-year canary is quite distinct from most of its kin in several respects. It is non-dimorphic, both in appearance and niche, and male and female are equally sized and eat the same foods: seeds, nectar, insects, and a small amount of green leaves and buds. They are also monogamous, picking only a single mate and staying with them for the remainder of their lives. It is still an R strategist like its ancestors, however, and the sheer length of time it takes to mature means that only a very small percentage of its offspring survive to adulthood. Perhaps 1 out of 100 in the best of conditions. The female ninth-year canary does not search out any sort of nest in which to lay her eggs, and she does not provide her young with anything to eat. Throughout the duration of her short lifespan, she simply deposits them on the forest floor as she forages for food, laying them wherever she is at, every 20 to 40 minutes. The eggs are tiny and without shells, protected only by a thin, rubbery membrane, and hatch within 2 days wherever they lie. The literally maggot-like young of these changeling birds are now even further derived than their early ancestors. They are completely ectothermic, able to survive incredibly low temperatures by going dormant, returning to growth when conditions warm, and are now entirely free-living and generalist in diet. Their mother is now completely freed of parental duty, and the minute larvae simply wriggle into the cool, moist refuge of the leaf litter and begin to feed themselves on anything organic that they come across. The majority of her young will not survive, whether they are hatched in a position unsuitable for their survival, or more likely are eaten by predators early on. But by laying so many more eggs than she requires to replace herself and her mate in the population, she hedges her bets and ensures that most likely at least 2 will manage. The young are most vulnerable to predators in their first few days, as they crawl through the leaf litter and are easily snapped up by other birds, invertebrates, and fishes hunting on the ground. Once they move below ground and beneath the root systems of the trees, there are far fewer predators able to access them, and they are insulated from cold winter temperatures. Nonetheless, 9 years is a very long time to spend growing up, and the odds are not in their favor that at some point during that time they will not run into some sort of predator. The lucky few which avoid an early end spend the better part of the next decade slowly gnawing away on roots and rhizomes, gradually growing into a pink grub-shaped blob up to 10 times their adult size. Toward the fall of their 8th year, when plump and fat, they construct a burrow just below the surface in which to pupate. Spending the winter dormant in its larval state, it rapidly begins developing over the course of 2 to 3 months as soon as spring arrives, to emerge from the ground as a fully fledged, mature adult bird toward the height of the Serina summer, timed just right for when their choice foods are most abundant. After courting and mating around the clock for several weeks' time, both sexes will die. The process comes over the birds rapidly, and most frequently, they go from fluttering with vigor in the morning, sleepy in the afternoon, and fallen from their perches before nightfall. Males typically die several days earlier than the females, most likely of exhaustion, for they feed less than females in their intense urge to mate, particularly toward the end of the breeding season. The female typically remains near the male as he passes, as if to provide comfort. Females follow within a week's time, seemingly of nothing more than loneliness. In fact, starvation is usually the acute causative agent, but only because the female all but ceases to feed when her partner dies, no matter how much food remains available to her. Though she has used up all her eggs by this time and rendered infertile, there seems no practical reason that she would not be able to survive considerably longer, but evolution has apparently rendered her species, through a combination of biological and behavioral adaptations, so that she spends no more time than she needs to reproduce her kind. So strong is the 9th year's innate behavioral pattern that if a female's mate is killed early in the season, even though she may still be carrying fertile eggs and other males may court her, she will very rarely accept another mate and will pine just as she would otherwise, several weeks earlier, suggesting that the mechanism behind her short lifespan truly is behavioral in nature. They simply stop feeding after the loss of their partners. It is possible such behavior evolved initially so that parents would not compete with their offspring. But given the extreme disparity between the lifespan of the adult in this instance and the period it takes its young to mature, if this were ever effective, it no longer has any practical application today. Free-living larvae are not unique to the 9th year canary, but evolved as long as 20 million years ago. Presumably, they originated from especially mobile nest-bound larvae which, perhaps provided with insufficient larders to feed them until maturity, crawled out of their nest sites to find food elsewhere. To aid them, their sense of smell became more developed at an earlier age. Their metabolism adjusted so that they could continue to feed and grow at ambient temperatures, and their diets broadened to include plant foods, with the side effects that such meals are considerably less nutritious, and in conjunction with a slowed metabolism, growth would take longer as a result. The 9th year canary system is, however, an extreme example, and most of its kin mature much more quickly, in a matter of months. The selection forces behind the lengthy infancy of the 9th year canary are unknown, but it has been hypothesized that the modern 9th year bird may in fact be a relic species headed towards extinction, which historically may have existed at far greater population density and emerged in huge numbers, which emerged in swarms to overwhelm predators, similarly to the periodical cicada on Earth. What could have so greatly reduced the bird's population to only a few thousand adults across all of the island during emergent years? Hardly enough to overwhelm any predators, and in some locales, so few that pairs may have to travel substantial distances just to find a single mate, is unknown. Perhaps a less stable climate resulting from recent global warming is to blame, An increase in unseasonable warm periods early in the season and unpredictable cold spells later over the past few thousand years, having caused most of the former population to emerge at unfavorable times and not manage to reproduce, leaving only a fraction of their kind left today. It also has no close relatives on the island or anywhere else, with so drastically long a larval period to compare it to. Whatever the mechanism behind its evolution, the ninth-year canary, even though its day may be coming to an end, will still go down as one of Serina's most fleeting natural wonders. Back to the Kyrans at the end of days. Since we last checked in upon them 25 million years ago, the Kyran Islands have undergone dramatic change. Most dramatically, they are no longer islands, having become a land bridge between the now interconnected eastern and western hemispheres. They have subsequently become not simply invaded, but literally the bridge across which invasive species from both directions have been steadily spilling over for the past 5 million years. The result has been catastrophic to the island's endemic flora and fauna, the great majority of which has proven poorly competitive in the face of more vigorous mainland counterparts. On top of this, the Kyrans' equatorial location is now leaving them among the most harshly affected regions on Serina by climate change, as what remains of the formerly forested islands now experience increasingly intense heat, prolonged drought, and subsequent desertification. Among the hardest hit groups are the browsers, as forests shrink back rapidly at a rate of several tens of miles per year, until they occur only along the very edges of the sea, where storms and ocean fog support some patchy, stunted trees. Additionally, the naive trees of the Kyrans evolved without any ant symbiosis, meaning that they carry no defenses against ant trees like those on the mainland had developed, either in the form of their own protective colonies or sticky, resinous sap that serves to gunk up the insect's mouthparts. Leafcutter ants decimate the sparse remnants of the Kyran endemic forest, with the increasingly few places suited for tree growth at all being colonized by invasive myrmecophytes and largely insect-immune glue-trap trees. The result, unfortunately, is the extinction of the browsing elephantches. Grazers would initially be suspected to survive the drying conditions better as savannas came to dominate the region, but as their endemic native grasses are quickly displaced by toxic assassin grasses, which leave the naive grazers with a potentially fatal instance of high blood sugar if eaten in too great a quantity, they too begin to die out, starting with the young, which are more rapidly intoxicated and require less of the grass's poison to experience illness. Having had no time to adjust to the grass's defenses as the birds from mainland ecosystems did, the Kyrans' endemic grazers too will vanish with their former food plants by the end of the Thermocene. A splendid example in evolutionary design, but one unfortunately not suited to such significant change. The Kyrans' endemic predators will follow their prey to extinction, for though they will feed successfully on new colonist species such as vivas and tribits for a while, their young will be too vulnerable to other predators in the end, and their populations will die out. unable to reproduce after the last adult individuals age out. Even the Kyrans' smaller inhabitants, the soft-billed birds, the snuffles and their kin, suffer now as they lose their cover with the loss of the forests, and their main food supply of worms and invertebrates dwindles as the ground becomes parched and dry. Smaller species still hold on in grassland burrows, but now face an even greater threat: new predators. Formerly, the snuffles were safe from predation in their burrows, their only predators being large, skulking birds. Once the islands collided with Walteria, a new group quickly moved in to take advantage. A group of large, advanced tribits, capable of following prey down their burrows, or if that failed, digging them out with their claws. These mammal-like predators filled a niche totally absent on the Kyrans before, meaning that the snuffles had no natural defense against them. The tribits which have moved into and through the Kyrans are a new breed. To be referred from here on as tribitheres, they are agile, cat-like hunters with upright gaits, warm-blooded metabolism, and a fuzzy, hair-like pelage derived from individual highly elongated scales. Their skin is watertight, their need for water is low. Their large gill plate-derived ears serve well to radiate excess heat, and they give birth to live offspring, not to eggs which are vulnerable to desiccation or predatory assault, meaning they thrive in these new, harshly competitive and hot and dry conditions. Some of the first animals to colonize a newly peninsular Kyrran islands. Several members of this new tribit group exploded in size here as a result of a lack of competition. Some species now grow up to 30 pounds, a 30-fold increase from their rat-sized ancestors, and can thus now subdue quite large prey animals, including adult snuffles, which they easily dig out of their burrows or ambush in the night when both species are out hunting. Smaller forms can simply slide down their burrows and kill them as well as destroy their nests from within. Having reached far larger sizes than they ever were able to on the mainland where they evolved, they were now substantial competitors and predators in their own right by the time the large, flightless mainland birds reached the Kyrans and were able to compete right alongside them, not being restricted to the undergrowth any longer. In addition to devastating the various defenseless ground birds evolved on the islands, these new and larger tribitheres, which evolved in the Kyrans, have now begun moving back east as well as into the west, taking new niches that before were not feasible for their ancestors forced to remain small by large, predatory birds. A desert tribithere catches a snuffle. For the humble tribit, things are starting to look up. For the native life of the Kyrans, though, as for many charismatic megafaunal animals across Serina, the future is largely bleak. Of all their beautifully bizarre diversity, in the end, only 2 species will make it through to the end of the Thermocene. They are each very different creatures, with histories separated by countless generations. Yet they will both follow a similar path to survive what will be, for most of the rest of life on Serina, the end of days. 200,000 years more have passed since we last checked in on the world of Serina, and environmental conditions have become increasingly harsh and unstable. Serina sits now directly on the Thermocene Pangeocene boundary, a period marked by extreme volcanism, widespread desertification, and ocean anoxia, which will last through the next 2.5 million years. The past few 100,000 years have seen the formation of a huge mantle plume between Striata and Walteria. A massive series of flood basalt eruptions results, similar to the earlier Striatan Traps event that kickstarted the Thermocene, but now larger than anything seen so far in Serina's inhabited history. By the start of the Pangeocene, an epoch which, for most of its history, will be characterized by the presence of one major supercontinent on the Moon and only a few smaller isolated landmasses, virtually the entirety of what remains of Striata will be buried up to 3 miles high under millions of cubic miles of magma. The stronger eruptions resultant from the Walterian traps, unlike the slower, more flowing eruptions from the earlier, sizable, but much less destructive Striatan traps, will periodically produce intense explosions and release huge amounts of dust and debris into the atmosphere. Following the latest eruptions, these atmospheric dust clouds have and will periodically continue to reach such concentrations that at times they will become so dense as to block out the sun. The result, despite continued skyrocketing carbon dioxide levels and uncontrolled global warming, is the appearance of major short-term cooling events. More than once, following particularly intense periods of volcanism lasting several thousand years or more, the North Pole and all surrounding regions, including Borea and Polar Anciska, become locked in ice and devoid of plant or animal life. In some instances, these brief ice ages will last upwards of 20,000 years, long enough for glaciers to form and even move towards the equator, toward the northernmost regions of the forming supercontinent. Several series of eruptions already experienced have been so large and powerful, and the quantity of dust they brought into the Moon's atmosphere, that they have darkened the planet's sun in the northern hemisphere for months at a time. The aftermath of this, in conjunction with the complete extinction of terrestrial plant communities in far northern regions, is the complete extinction of terrestrial ecosystems on any isolated landmasses north of the supercontinent. The arc of Polar Anciska and the isolated land of Borea are reduced to barren outcrops of stone. All the while, in between the most extreme eruption periods, uncontrolled greenhouse gases result in extreme periods of heating. As the eruptions release countless millions of tons of carbon dioxide, each period of intense cooling is eventually replaced by one of even greater stifling heat as soon as the dust settles out of the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide continues to enter the oceans, worsening their acidity. Over the long term, temperatures on Serina continue to rise, melting all newly formed glaciation and ice caps from polar regions, and causing catastrophic rise and fall of sea levels. Marine temperatures reach deadly levels numerous times at the Thermocene-Pangeocene boundary, as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit in shallow equatorial seas. Temperatures absolutely lethal to all life except extremophile bacteria. With the seas virtually lifeless across much of Serina by this time, surviving sea life other than microbes isolated to the small forms of algae, fishes, and invertebrates able to survive in sporadic pockets of oxygenated surface waters in habitable polar seas, there is little to move nutrients and dissolved gases through the water column. The oceans, already anoxic at deep levels, thus become almost completely devoid of oxygen as a result of extreme temperature spikes near the surface. The carbon influx is even more destructive now than before, following the complete shutdown of photosynthesis in the northern hemisphere and most of the global seas, meaning that very little can now be sequestered out of the atmosphere. During cold periods, life on Serina becomes uninhabitable anywhere north of the equator. Between them, temperatures all along the equator rise to more than 140 degrees Fahrenheit, fatally hot for almost all terrestrial life for prolonged periods. A 3 million years long seesaw between fire and ice rack Serina's remaining ecosystems to their cores in a period of intense climactic unrest that will come to be referred to alternatively as Armageddon, where life must fight to survive what is seemingly the end of the world. Serina's southern pole, the regions which once were the lower portions of Stevlandia and Kari, is the least affected region throughout Armageddon. But the climate even here is unstable and harsh for higher life compared to anything the Thermocene had to offer. Conditions are as well extremely seasonal, ranging from sub-zero to more than 110 degrees Fahrenheit, with ice ages bringing respite from the worst summer heat, but worsening winters, and the intermittent hot periods producing milder winters but extreme summer heights. The northern half of the southern habitable belt is largely arid desert, but coastal regions support limited life through oceanic fog and summer storms that blow in from the sea. True forests are by this time restricted solely to a thin band along the southernmost edge of the new supercontinent, which now performs more than 95% of all photosynthesis occurring on the planet. Until the end of the volcanic period, it will be the only ecosystem on the entire moon which still serves to sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Almost everywhere else, photosynthetic communities have been totally broken down. The seas reach a new level of stagnation not seen since the start of the Hypostacene, while land at the equator is reduced to barren, sun-scorched desert, virtually sterile of the kingdom of life, in that at the poles reduced to nothing more than solid ice in the cold times and algae-encrusted bare rock in the hot ones. The almost total loss, globally, of photosynthesis results in a substantial decrease in atmospheric oxygen levels. This is exacerbated further by the proliferation of extremophile anaerobic bacteria, which produce toxic hydrogen sulfide gas in the steaming equatorial oceans. Together, and coupled with extremely high concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, such as methane released with the repeated thawing of polar ice caps. These events produce an atmosphere that could be considered downright toxic to a great majority of life. As if to kick the remaining life while it is already clearly down, the reduction of atmospheric oxygen results in a global thinning of the ozone layer, particularly along the equator, but also near the South Pole, where the last land ecosystems cling precariously to life, allowing harmful radiation to reach the moon's surface and increasing the incidences of cancer and other deleterious mutations noticeably by the end of the era. Plants experienced a heightened rate of mutation, mostly negative, but persisted, offsetting high rates of radiation-induced infertility with even higher numbers of offspring, ensuring at least a few would survive. Remaining land animals were all but forced into nocturnal niches to avoid the harsh solar rays during the daytime. The Thermocene-Pangeocene boundary, a literal Armageddon for life as we knew it, will go down as the most extreme, volatile, and simply devastating extinction event in the history of life as we know it, even more destructive than the Great Dying at the end of the Permian on Earth. More than 99% of life on Serina is obliterated over the course of 3 million years. But the unrest would not last forever. The extreme South Pole had provided a small but sustainable pocket of refuge for a limited pool of terrestrial and freshwater life. A small remnant population for sure, but one which contained among it a sampling of the varied tapestry of life which had evolved all across the world, each one having been pushed to the bottom of the world together as their isolated continents became one. Eventually, these continents would settle together and the magma plume would recede. As volcanism slowed, extreme climatic changes became milder. Fresh water released in enormous quantities from short-lived polar ice caps throughout the boundary period would begin to flow over the surface of the heavier and virtually stagnant saltwater, producing shallow rivers of pure, freshly oxygenated water down from the polar regions toward the equator. Following the rivers would be the plants, algae from the northern islands, and a variety of flora from the southern refuge. Soon, the sea would be overgrown with a carpet of green floating vegetation. Floating on just this shallow layer of freshwater and spreading at a phenomenal rate. As they grew, they were sequestering the surplus of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, releasing huge quantities of oxygen in its place. As they did so, temperatures cooled and rainfall returned to the equator. As soon as it did so, terrestrial grasslands and finally forest communities tentatively migrated back northwards from their final holdout in the south. Slowly, tentatively, but surely, life would recolonize the regions scraped clean at the end of the Thermocene. The Pangeocene had arrived.